back. I've never been to the high school before, and it's a wonderful place. And I got to tour your chapel, which is beautiful. We're building a new chapel at Aquinas College that should be done by the summer. That also I think will be a beautiful chapel and worthy of the name of a Catholic church. And I'd like to thank Brian Fink for inviting me tonight and for getting to visit with the alumni Ben and Rita Johnson earlier, getting to meet Father Mattson. I spent quite a bit of time with his brother this past week, where we had a screening of a film at Aquinas College, which was a very good event for the college. Tonight I'm going to talk about the history of American religious liberty, and I did leave an outline outside the door, so if you didn't get that, you won't be able to follow along at all. That's not really true. But what's on that outline are quotations from some of the texts that I'll mention, like the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom and that sort of thing. So if you wanted to have that source right in front of you, wouldn't hurt. And I think you'll be able to hear that right outside this door here. So this is a talk I've given before in other places. I speak at Acton University every summer in Grand Rapids, which is a wonderful conference. If you ever get the chance to attend that, one of the primary themes there is religious liberty. And at least in recent years here, when I talked about religious liberty, it was always in the context of my last book, the Missionaries of Republicanism book, which prominently features anti-Catholicism in American history. But it was always talking about history. And then all of a sudden it seemed like I was talking more about contemporary events and things like the HHS mandate, among other things. And so I did a lot more thinking on it. So that's what I'll be talking about tonight. I was told for a Lenten observance, you were up for a 3-hour lecture. And that's what we're in for. Hope that's okay. Actually, when Brian invited me, he said, we're doing this Lenten thing. Can you speak? And I didn't know how to take that, actually. In 1788, the long American Revolution came to an end when the United States of America ratified the U.S. Constitution in an attempt to create a more perfect union. Americans quickly amended their Constitution 10 times. Added in 1791, the first of these amendments in part reads, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Thus, as the first clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution, Americans added what Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, called the most cherished of American freedoms, and that is religious freedom. Or as the American bishops unanimously put it a few years ago, our first most cherished liberty. When Mickey Mouse's hands have moved around an hour, I'll know I'm done. The Revolutionary War, which had ended in 1783, had largely dampened religious tensions in the 13 colonies in the name of presenting a united front against English tyranny. Fighting for a republican, or that is representative government, and liberty against a foreign Protestant monarch had carved out space for Catholics in the unfolding American story. The alliance between the revolutionaries and Catholic France had even furthered that. And so American Catholics founded their first churches in Boston and New York in the 1780s. Even so, in that same decade, 7 of the 13 states passed laws ensuring that only Protestants could hold elective office. Once the Constitution forbade religious tests, most states quickly repealed these laws and moved to disestablish their state churches. But New York, however, did not repeal its anti-Catholic laws until the early 1820s, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. Massachusetts waited until 1833 to disestablish the Congregational Church in Massachusetts. That next year, 1834, a preacher by the name of Lyman Beecher, the very famous Beecher family, Harriet Beecher Stowe, etc., preached a series of sermons in Boston in which he encouraged Americans to be wary of the Ursuline nuns who had set up shop in Boston, saying that their convent and school was not an example of religious freedom, but was exactly the specter of religious oppression. And in fact, Catholics were poised to take over the country. And later that night, a group of men left Beecher's sermons, went to the Ursuline convent and school, ushered the nuns out into the night, and burned the school and the church to the ground. That was 1834. 10 years later, in 1844, there was a series of riots in Philadelphia that also involved the burning of Catholic churches, Catholic schools, and Irish Catholic neighborhoods. This included pitched battles with the local militia. This is some of that I cover at length in my Missionaries of Republicanism book. And I didn't bring any copies with me tonight, but if you want to see a picture of my 4-year-old daughter, she's very cute, and she always needs shoes. And if you were to buy one on Amazon later, I'm sure she'd love it. But that book covers more prominently anti-Catholicism and American identity as it was intermixed and going westward, and what did it mean to be an American, and for most Americans that meant to be Protestant, but also anti-Catholic in the sense that they might not even be able to enunciate, and how that figured into the war against Mexico in the 1840s. But also in the 1840s, warfare and state-sponsored violence in several states against Mormons also led to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS, the Mormons, being driven into the West. And then in the 1850s came the prominent political party, the Know Nothings. You maybe have heard of the Know Nothings, nearly winning the presidency in 1856. And then anti-Catholicism went on to play a significant role in the presidential campaigns of 1884, with the Republicans accusing the Democratic Party of being the party of Romanism, and rebellion. Nowadays, I guess it would be, founders, and I don't know, but okay. In 1928, there was Al Smith in the campaign, and with the Klan leading the way to fight Al Smith, who was the first Catholic candidate of a major political party that year, the Democratic Party. And then even in 1960, with John Kennedy having to go give a speech before the Baptist ministers in Dallas, Texas, to explain how he was Catholic, but not so Catholic that he'd let the Pope tell him what to do when it came to governing the country. By the 1970s, the threat to religious liberty, and in particular to Catholic religious freedom, began to come not from evangelical Protestants, with whom there was going to be a kind of ecumenism in the trenches of the anti-abortion movement starting in the late 70s, not from them, not from nativists, but from radically secular ideologues. Today, the late Cardinal George argues in his last book, A Godly Humanism, Americans are living not in a Christian civilization, but in a post-Christian one. It is also aggressively secular. George's succinct definition of secularism is this. He calls it, quote, an atheistic position that excludes God explicitly as an impermissible hypothesis. Secularity, he says, may be understood as the pursuit of human activity without any explicit or public reference to God or to religious belief. The U.S. government, like most Americans, does not view secularism as an ideology and a worldview steeped in its own absolute claims, but rather as a neutral stance towards reality. Thus, the U.S. government enforces secularism in ways that the First Amendment would prevent if Americans understood secularism as the ideology or the inverted religion, to use Russell Kirk's phrase, that it actually is. In other words, contrary to the Establishment Clause, we do have an established church in this country, but it's not really a church, it's an anti-church, claiming neutrality, but being unneutral even when it comes to facing the historical and natural reality of things like marriage and what constitutes a human being. This secularism is why, as George says in his book, The Difference God Makes, I like Cardinal George's books, that Americans struggle so mightily to function as a community. Americans struggle to function as a community, he says, because they possess no unifying transcendent vision. Only their individual desires and wants and impulses. This is most unlike the unity of transcendent purpose within Christendom that at least recognize freedom as necessary to reach the final end of mankind. That final purpose being to know, to love, and to serve God. So too did Christians recognize the social consequences of their belief. Most Americans, on the other hand, unquestioningly conflate freedom with individualism. And so they tend to understand nowadays religious freedom only in the limited church-state context, where one cares for the spiritual good of the people, another orders public life. And so real dialogue, genuinely concerned with the pursuit of truth, cannot take place. The result is today's curious mix of decadence, ennui, and ravenous individualism. Objective truth is sacrificed at the altar of subjective freedom. And any claim to universal truth is, in George's words, dismissed as evidence of intolerance. In other words, post-Christian America is not interested in freedom in truth. It is interested in non-interference with radically autonomous desires, no matter how out of step with reality those desires happen to be. I sketch this brief outline of religious bigotry and violence, and for that matter, in order to remind us just how radical and even countercultural the framers of the Constitution were. This way we can see what the framers hoped to accomplish with the religious freedom clauses in the First Amendment. And so that's really the primary point of my talk tonight, is going to be looking at the background to the First Amendment, and religious freedom is this thing that's still a work in progress and is as radical today as it was then. Americans then recognized the absolute need for virtue in a republic where the people ruled. So you think about it, if a person cannot govern himself interiorly, then how can he expect to govern others? How can he expect to contribute to the common good? This is what also lay behind some of what we would characterize as religious bigotry. And that's why I'll spend, as I said, most of the time looking at episodes of intolerance leading up to the First Amendment. Again, just to show us how radical the First Amendment was, and really to put it into its historical context, and to show that it's still radical today. Americans naturally connected their religious liberty to their political liberty and their ability to live free of government coercion, whether large or small. And this doesn't mean they weren't nervous about suspect groups whose beliefs were thought to be antithetical to civil liberty or to religious liberty. In America, historically, this has mainly included Catholics and Mormons, and more recently, Muslims have joined that list. Until quite recently, though, say the 1950s, the story of religious liberty in America looked like this. It was one with an overwhelmingly Protestant population trying to figure out how to deal with religious plurality, not just among themselves, which was difficult enough, especially in the 1800s, but more importantly with massive immigration by Catholics in the 1800s and in the early 1900s. And so in case you missed it then, I just like to tell people what the thesis is. Why leave it to mystery? Mysteries for the good fathers here. There has never been a time in American history where the freedom of religion was not under some kind of threat, and when the understanding of religious freedom contained in the First Amendment was not in fact, if not in principle, a disputed notion. And so the historical context is this. The first thing we'll look at is the persecution, violence, and state-established churches that existed in Europe and then made their way to the Americas and in the 13 colonies. The converse of having an established church is to have legal disabilities on every other church in some way, and religions that are tolerated to some degree, but with one at the top of the pecking order, or the food chain. I used to say food chain, and kids these days are taught about a food web, and then they say, what's a food chain? So, but you get the pecking order thing. The second context was the so-called Enlightenment of the 1600s and 1700s. I say so-called Enlightenment because when people call themselves enlightened, you should be suspicious of them. If all religions are equally absurd and something which mankind needs to outgrow, then why not have liberty? I mean, what's the big deal? Especially as if George Washington believed and later stated in his farewell address in 1796, the religion produces morality, and morality is necessary for a republic to flourish. But in a way, it doesn't really matter what that religion is, would be the sense the Enlightenment might have. And third, there's what Edmund Burke called salutary neglect. That would apply here too. He applied that to how American culture had developed out of reach of the King and Queen of England. And when the King of England finally decided to ratchet up the governing structure of the colonies, the people resisted. It had just been too long. They had lived free for too long. But it applies to religion too. Religious diversity proliferated and flourished in England's North American colonies because there was no control from the mother country. And the king liked to dump his Quakers in the Americas, the king dumped his Catholics in Americas, the king dumped his Puritans, all the people who seemed like they were troublemakers back home. And so at least in the time period of colonial America, up through the 1790s, most religious controversies centered on the question of whether Catholicism was compatible or not with republican government, that is, representative government. That is, did being a good and faithful Catholic mean that one could not be a good and faithful citizen of any place other than Rome and the Papal States? And so the thinking went like this. If Roman Catholicism was indeed incompatible with republican government, and if the foundations of republicanism lay in Protestant Christianity, as most Americans believed it did, then Americans actually had a duty to oppose Roman Catholicism and strengthen Protestant Christianity in order to keep their country free. So that limiting the freedom of Catholics, especially those recently arrived from European monarchies with no experience of self-government, limiting their freedom actually ensured religious freedom. And because it ensured religious freedom, it also protected civil liberties. And so they would have described the truth of this paradox would have seemed as sensible and uncontroversial to them as confining criminals to jail in order to protect the community from further crime. Or you could just let them roam around free in the name of liberty, hoping that they'll morally regenerate themselves. But that's at least the interior logical argument of the anti-Catholicism. And so it's, I'm a historian, so you try to have, you try to give a sympathetic reading of the other side. I think Thomas Aquinas did that too, before destroying them. So here's the background in England. Much of the anti-Catholic sentiment came from, with the earliest colonists from England, particularly with the Puritans, who settled New England in the 1630s. In the 1640s and 50s, England underwent 2 decades of civil warfare, during which time the Puritans, who wanted to purify the Church of England of any remaining Catholic elements, get rid of the bishops, that kind of thing. But the Puritans and other factions fought to rule England. Oliver Cromwell rose to the top, murdered the king, dissolved the House of Lords, committed genocide in Ireland, and then ruled as Lord Protector. By 1660, the monarchy was restored. England figured out it couldn't live without a House of Lords and without a king, and Cromwell had died. So from exile, they brought back Charles II, whose dad had his head chopped off by Cromwell and his men. But as soon as Charles II came back, Parliament passed laws to force Catholics and Puritans to conform to the Anglican Church. And if they didn't, they would have severe legal disabilities. The difficulty Parliament had was that Charles was sympathetic to Catholicism, and his brother James, who was heir to the throne, was Catholic. And so one of the neat things you can do, I guess, if you're king, is just not call Parliament to meet. The Constitution says Congress has to meet. Whether we like it or not, they have to meet. But not the case in England. So when Charles suspended the laws against Catholics and Puritans, Parliament passed this thing called the Test Act, which said that only Anglicans could hold military and civil offices. A religious test, in other words, for high government. Then Parliament tried to pass the Exclusion Bill that stated no professed Catholic could hold the throne of England. That law still holds. So it would have barred James, in other words, from taking the throne. So again, to solve this problem, Charles just didn't call Parliament anymore, and it didn't meet for a few years. James became king, imposed religious toleration on England, violated the Test Act by appointing Catholics to high places in government, but there was no rebellion. Anybody recall why there was no rebellion? Because James was quite old, and he had no heir. And his successors were the 2 Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne, who had been born to his first wife. But in 1688, lo and behold, it looks like James had been eating all his veggies. And he had a son by his second wife. That's the kind of thing I said I wouldn't say, knowing this was recorded. I was talking to Ben and Rita earlier. Now it was obvious his successor was going to be Catholic, and he might end up being an 8-year-old Catholic by the time he takes the throne, and then a cardinal, who's it, or bishop, what's it, is going to be the one in charge. This struck fear in Parliament. So Parliament traveled to visit to visit Mary and her husband, the Dutch man William of Orange, and offer them the crown. And William and Mary raised an army, invaded England, while James and his wife and son fled to France. Protestants called this the Glorious Revolution. You've maybe heard that term, as did later English history books. That is what the victors called it. And it was meant to imply that it was nearly bloodless and that the English people rose up to oust their tyrannical Catholic overlord. But as usual, the truth is more complicated. There were several years of fighting from 1688 to 1691. There was a massive battle in Ireland called the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 that's still celebrated in Northern Ireland with the Orange Order parades. I had the opportunity when I led a Lilly-funded grant group of professors to a peace and reconciliation seminar in Ireland for 3 weeks a few years ago to attend one of those Orange Order parades. And I guess I'll just say I never thought I'd be at an Orange Order parade. And we'll leave it at that if you want to know the rest of the story. But it's called being incognito, I'll say that. Under William issued the Act of Toleration. So this will give you an idea what toleration meant in 1689. All except Catholics and anyone who didn't believe in the Trinity, which meant Jews and Unitarians, all would be tolerated. Only the Church of England would have full political rights, but everyone else would be tolerated unless they were Catholic or Jewish or Unitarian. So I sketched this pretty hefty background of English history because this was religious liberty as the American colonists knew it. That is, a confessional state, meaning a nation that confesses one faith above all others, a confessional state with one established church, where most, but not all religions were allowed, but with varying degrees of legal restrictions. And there was some spillover into the colonies of this Protestant ascendancy, particularly in Maryland, which had been a colony that had been established as a haven for Catholics. In 1649, Lord Baltimore himself had approved a Toleration Act in Maryland, which actually tolerated all Christians, meaning all Trinitarian Christians, and prevented public criticism of another person's religion. That toleration came to an end with the overthrow of James II. On hearing of James II's overthrow, the Protestant settlers expelled the Catholic appointees of Lord Baltimore, outlawed Catholic education. It would leave a pretty big physical plant here, wouldn't it? Forbade public attendance at Mass, and taxed Catholics at twice the rate of Protestants. There was, in fact, tension in English colonial America over religion, where the Church of England technically was the official church from the very beginning. So here's the way it looked in Virginia, and it'll become clear later why I want to mention Virginia so much. But the population was so spread out in the 1600s in Virginia that half of the parishes didn't have ministers, and most people couldn't get to a service on Sunday, even if they wanted to, even if they tried. So they had religious freedom by default in the Chesapeake area. Government coercion was impossible. Massachusetts, on the other hand, was settled in 1630 by John Winthrop and his Puritans with the express religious conviction to create a city on a hill. And worldly Europe would look at the city on a hill there in Massachusetts, and they would repent of their ungodly ways once they realized a godly commonwealth was actually possible on this earth, that you could actually do it here. And then the Church of England would complete its purification of Catholic dogma and practice and its whole episcopal structure that it had retained when it had been in union with Rome. That connection, interestingly enough, was challenged almost immediately by Roger Williams, who proposed the complete separation of civil and religious authority. There was no separation of church and state by intent. If you weren't a Puritan, you couldn't be in government. No Christian should be ruled by a non-Christian, the Puritans had thought. Roger Williams thought otherwise. He said, civil affairs will always corrupt the saints. A radical solution to keep the saints uncorrupted would be to separate civil and religious authority. And so John Winthrop banished Roger Williams to Providence Plantation. This is where people used to go in those days when they were troublemakers. They would send them to Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson was another famous case of somebody being exiled. And you might ask, I thought they just killed people in those days. Well, they did if they thought you were a witch. And in Massachusetts, they were still burning Quakers at the state around 1700 and that sort of thing, but not in all cases. The trials of Williams and Hutchinson showed what kind of power the government and magistrates of Massachusetts could yield in both civil and religious affairs when you mix those two. And the two were tied together. Williams was banished for trying to separate them. So Puritan New England, in fact, then was an authoritarian community by choice. They thought in a way, and I think this is a fairly rational look at it, they're isolated in the wilderness of North America, and anybody who's bucking the system or threatening to upend the whole thing is pretty dangerous. So it's best just to exile them. So it's not always specifically about differences of opinion. Williams and Winthrop were actually good friends, and Winthrop had invited Williams, in fact, to come to Massachusetts in the first place. Winthrop liked to talk about two kinds of liberty. The first kind of liberty was what he called natural liberty. And he, in his writings, he says, natural liberty is common to man with beasts and other creatures. And that is just the individual's liberty. But where does civil liberty come from? Civil liberty, he said, arises out of political covenants and constitutions. Quote, civil liberty is maintained and expressed in a way of subjection to authority. The people have to, Winthrop wrote, quietly and cheerfully submit unto that authority which is set over you in all the administration of it for your own good. That's the conception of liberty and even civil liberty that established a tone of government in New England on into the 1730s, when another event that I like to put quotations around, the Great Awakening, occurred. Have you heard of the Great Awakening? Does this sound familiar? Okay. By the 1730s, parts of British America, nearly every part, except for Pennsylvania, had an established church. That is, every colony had a legally privileged institution. In New England, it was the Congregational Church. The individual congregations, Winthrop had imagined, had actually morphed into a denomination with a structure. It was the Anglican Church, the Church of England in the southern colonies, and then in the middle colonies, in Pennsylvania and New York, there was so much more religious and ethnic diversity that there was no tie between a single church and state. There was no state-supported religion in Pennsylvania. And in New York, there was choice in terms of every local community getting to choose its own church. The Dutch Reformed, the Congregational, the Anglican, and support it with local taxes. But in the 1730s, the Anglican gentry in Virginia couldn't figure out how to find people who would be willing to put their lives on the line and live in Appalachia under threat of Indian attack. So the elite Anglican gentry along the eastern seaboard are looking for a buffer between them and the Indians in the interior. Where to find such people? The answer were the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, who had no religious liberty back in the United Kingdom. And so the Virginians offered them religious liberty, and once they got there, they reneged on the offer of religious liberty and forbade them to preach along the frontier. There was anything near that kind of freedom in New England. Okay, Baptists and Quakers and Anglicans couldn't even worship openly in Connecticut until about 1710. And so this is an important phrase to remember in contemporary dialogue. Freedom of worship is what they're slowly being allowed, but not freedom of religion. And they're two different things, and the distinction's an important one to draw. Okay, religious freedom is going to impact society more broadly. Freedom of worship just means you're free to do your thing on Sunday morning and then don't tell anybody about it and don't try to affect society in any other way. Just go home. You know, it's your hobby. In 1727, Massachusetts and Connecticut finally stopped taxing non-congregationalists to support the Congregational Church. But there still was religious taxation. It's just your taxes would now go to support your own church. So out of all the 13 colonies that became the United States, only Pennsylvania lacked the traditional European practice of religious taxation. And so this is what the so-called Great Awakening changed. These were evangelical Protestant revivals up and down the East Coast that stressed that salvation came from God. It was a free gift of grace, and everyone could be saved. And the theology was so simplified. The Protestant doctrine was so simplified with a focus on the conversion experience, that people found they didn't have as much to argue about before because they just didn't dig deeply into the doctrine. So to focus on Virginia for reasons that'll become clear, in Virginia, among the Baptists, who were the most overtly in favor of separating church and state, the Great Awakening swept through them. They opposed laws passed by the Assembly in Virginia to prohibit the preaching of Presbyterians, even though they weren't Presbyterian. They traveled as preachers and drew the lower classes into their churches. You had to buy a pew in those days in the Anglican churches. That reminds me of the only good thing John Adams could find to say about the Catholic Church was that at least you didn't have to buy a pew in a Catholic church. And I don't know if you sold pews here to raise money for your beautiful chapel, but you can't sit. You don't get to sit in the pew you donated for, right? You wouldn't just talk to me though if you want to donate to the Aquinas Chapel. I'll make sure you get your pew. So there's a certain ideological appeal to the Baptists. It's a very democratic creed. The Baptists condemned slavery. They eagerly sought black converts. They sought Indian converts. And so we had this interesting moment in American history, as it was in many places prior to the Civil War, though this changes afterwards, whereas now one of the least racially integrated institutions in the country is usually churches on Sunday morning. It's just the opposite in the 1700s in Virginia. I mean, this is a slave-owning colony of Virginia, and this is the work of the Baptists at the time. They're encouraging worshipers to call each other brother and sisters, and so thousands of ordinary farmers and others flocked to their fold, in spite of the fact that their taxes still went to pay for the Anglican clergy. And so by the time we get to the Revolution, about 1 out of 5 white Virginians and maybe half of the black slaves were Baptists of some kind or another by the time of the Revolution. And so in terms of the story of religious freedom and the historical context of the First Amendment, here's a legacy of the Great Awakening. It's that it promoted religious pluralism in a real way. For the most part, it was unintended. There just wasn't much focus on doctrine in it. That's what laid the groundwork for the expansion of religious freedom in Virginia at the hands of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the 1780s that I want to cover now. And I believe in the outline I gave you, which had the Act of Toleration. The next thing on the list is the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. I'm going to mention a bit about that. When I lived in Charlottesville, Virginia for a few years, I had the good fortune of living near Monticello and used to take a walk up there nearly every day. And there is Jefferson's tombstone. And on Jefferson's tombstone, if you've seen it, he's got the 3 accomplishments he's the most proud of. The Declaration of Independence, the founding of the University of Virginia. And you would think if you've been president, you might tell people, like you're at a cocktail party and they say, so what do you do? Or, that kind of thing. Jefferson is just not a big thing with him. The third thing was being author of the statute, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. These were his 3 biggest accomplishments, he thought. It was written by Jefferson in 1777, 1 year after he had helped draft Virginia's new Constitution, and he tried to include a portion on religious liberty. But it didn't get submitted to the Virginia Assembly until much later in the war, and it didn't get approved by the Assembly until 1786, almost the year before then, the year that Americans started to think that their current Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, wasn't working out, and maybe they needed a new one. There was a dispute in 1786 between those in Virginia who wanted to impose religious taxation in the name of the common good, and those who wanted no state establishment of religion. And so on the one side was James Madison, because Thomas Jefferson was in France, having a really good time, from what people have said, who wanted no state support at all. And then on the other side was Patrick Henry. And Patrick Henry wanted a religious tax that would then be divided among all the churches. So I guess the important point I would make here is, here it is the year before the U.S. Constitution was written in Philadelphia, and it still made sense to a significant number of Americans that states ought to have an established church. So that their idea of religious pluralism did not mean the lack of an established church And it did not necessarily mean the abolition of religious taxation. So following their thinking, if morality came from religion and not the other way around, then churches need to be supported by taxes every bit as much as any other entity that's crucial to the common good, like police and like fire and schools. This is how you want to think if you want to get inside their minds at least. So what was behind Jefferson's thinking and those who supported Madison? Jefferson said this. He said, quote, "Almighty God hath created the mind free. God is the only rightful and competent judge of creeds." That's Jefferson. Was this just a cloak of some kind of consequentialist toleration in the name of public order? Let's just tolerate everything and nobody gets hurt? Is it indifference to truth? Pope Gregory VI later worried about Americans and democratic peoples in Europe in 1832, and he wrote what became an infamous encyclical in the United States, but an interesting one that I deal with in my second book, and that's Morari Vos, where he had talked about religious freedom being masking indifference to truth oftentimes. And how do you tell the difference? Jefferson developed his belief in religious freedom over many years, but I would say this about Jefferson. It began with an impulse for toleration. It also began with the revolutionaries' hatred of coercion, but even for Jefferson, it was also about the search for truth. For Jefferson, toleration was not enough. I mean, toleration is better than coercion, and it's better than violence, and it's better than torture. I'm reading Evelyn Waugh's biography of Edmund Campion for Lent about many of the English martyrs there in the 1600s and late 1500s, which reminds me of, I'll just say it because it's funny, about Queen Elizabeth, or as I call her, Bloody Elizabeth, about Queen Elizabeth, and Waugh writes of Elizabeth that except for her profound deficiency in faith, hope, and charity, she possessed a naturally Catholic sentiment. I wish I could write that well. But it's not enough, Jefferson thought, for an established church to stoop to tolerate other religions and Christian sects. Jefferson has been pegged as anti-Catholic. I see him as a more anti-clerical or anti-episcopal than he is Catholic. That is, Jefferson just did not think any corporate human authority could judge belief. And he put the Catholic hierarchy in that, and what he called the bigotry of Jesuitism in that category. As an Enlightenment thinker, he thought only reason could do that. He wrote one book, Jefferson did, called The Notes on the State of Virginia, in which he wrote this, quote, "Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. Give a loose to them, and they will support the true religion by bringing every false one to their tribunal. They are the natural enemies of error and of error only." Jefferson had this really positive view of human nature, and therefore he had a very positive view of our rational powers, and meaning that he placed his trust not in faith and reason, but entirely in reason alone. Jefferson's view of conscience and each man judging for himself was rooted in John Locke. Here's what John Locke had said back in the late 1600s in the wake of the Glorious Revolution. He said, no civil authority had the right to punish individuals for religious belief. But the thing about Locke is he didn't really mean it. Because when Locke talked about religious toleration, he meant that the Church of England should tolerate every religious community except the Roman Catholic Church, the Society of Friends, and Jews. Because each of the three bore some element of non-Englishness and were suspect in terms of their patriotism, much as Americans viewed the Catholic immigrants coming to the United States in the early 1800s. So Jefferson wanted to improve on Locke. He had had positive experience in Virginia. Remember the experience in Virginia I described of religious freedom by default in some ways. He had had positive experience in Virginia with freedom, and he had negative experiences in Europe with corrupt confessional states. And this told him that it could and should be done. Besides human freedom, which made religious freedom an unalienable right, Jefferson just thought that state coercion could never be successful anyway. So he viewed religious freedom as a practical thing. And so he and Madison, anonymously, one should note, authored this writing called the Memorial and Remonstrance. And they promulgated it anonymously and introduced it to the Virginia Assembly. The tax bill got tabled, and in its place, they enacted Jefferson's Bill for Religious Freedom. So in other words, Patrick Henry lost, Madison and Jefferson won. The effect was to disestablish the Church of England in Virginia, and all this happened right on the cusp as Americans were deciding to scrap the Articles of Confederation, the first U.S. Constitution, and replace it with a new one. That the Constitutional Convention followed directly in the wake of this big disestablishment fight in Virginia. And Patrick Henry now found himself on the side of the anti-federalists who opposed the Constitution, and Madison, of course, supported the Constitution. The most common anti-federalist critique of the new Constitution, and one of the most submitted amendments in the state ratifying conventions, was that the Constitution lacked an explicit guarantee that the new central government would not establish one church. That's really their fear. All these colonies almost have their own church, right? But if you're going to create a new government, you don't want it to create a Church of America that would be similar to the Church of England. But above all, the anti-federalists were just concerned about the coercive powers of the new government. Madison was like the other Federalists. He thought a Bill of Rights would unintentionally limit liberties. In other words, if you listed all these things that are your liberties, what if you left a few out? And what could really good attorneys and rhetoricians do with this list in a way that they might argue that it's an exhaustive list and there exists no other liberties than what's on the Bill of Rights? That it might even give the central government the power to restrict the domestic practices of the states that were forming the Union. But Madison's the one who eventually relented and helped draw up the Bill of Rights. There were actually about 110 proposed amendments to the Constitution. So the way it would work is every state was going to ratify the Constitution in their own state, and a lot of them said, yeah, we don't want to ratify it unless you do this to it. And so there would be 20 or 30 amendments. There were well over 100, but there was a lot of repetition. The most common amendment where religion was concerned was to protect conscientious objectors from bearing arms on behalf of the new government. Usually, if they could pay another to serve in the militia in their stead. So in the meantime, the new government got underway. The anti-federalists decided not to become counter-revolutionaries and take up arms against the new government, but instead, in the words of one, I think it was Henry, they thought it's natural to care for the crazy machine. In other words, let's just see how it goes. This doesn't happen in most countries after one revolution, let alone your second constitution. But this is the way it went. And so the new president, Washington, informed the states that they could vote on these amendments. But George Mason actually wanted a real Bill of Rights, not a bunch of amendments. That is, an organized body of amendments in broad language to address all the really big concerns people had put forward in their fear of that this new U.S. government would have a tyranny over their body as well as their mind. And so it actually fell to Jefferson as the new Secretary of State to be the booster of the Bill of Rights in the Washington administration. And so 12 amendments were sent out to the states. Madison narrowed them down. And what became clear in the debate over these amendments was that the opinion Jefferson and Madison had during the fight over religious liberty in Virginia was winning. That was the new way of thinking. Not necessarily among the broad majority of Americans, but among their leaders especially. There was this broad conviction that religious freedom, freedom in general though, was safest in the hands of Protestants, in the general American population. But it's actually the clergy and a few others who were starting to think that anybody ought to be eligible for public office. Jews, Catholics. So religious freedom at that point, it's still a real work in progress. But the addition of the establishment and religious freedom clauses to the U.S. Constitution, this is a real key moment. Americans' understanding of it continues to evolve to this day. Mostly, I might add, in contradistinction to its original purpose and to the detriment of religion. Most of the states under the Constitution were still going to have established churches on into the 1820s and 1830s. The real fear was the U.S. government establishing a church. So it's an untried concept for the most part in 1791. This is where I say in conclusion, and you can breathe a sigh of relief and start thinking about which of the founders beers you're going to have afterwards. It's an untried concept. That is, definition of religious freedom was going to grow with time and with experience, the way all the good things grow. I mean, not foisted on the people as an ideology and a blueprint for utopia, but let's see how we do this, in other words, as we live it. And it was going to continue to grow until the mid-20th century when secularists defined religious freedom as a naked public square and actually instituted in a clandestine way religious tests for office in spite of the Constitution, so that you would use abortion rights or gay rights as the litmus test rather than an actual religious test. By the 21st century, that's our current century, outright, I still have to remind myself of that sometimes. It sounds so futuristic, like Duck Dodgers or something. By the 21st century, outright attacks on religious institutions through things like the HHS mandate and state laws regulating the adoption of children and normalizing so-called gay marriage. As I said, these are outright attacks on religious institutions. My hope is that this talk will help you place these kind of attacks on religious liberty in America. That is, just to be clear, the attempt to drive a variety of Christian religious institutions out of fields that are intrinsic to the Christian faith. Not extrinsic, not add-ons, not some things that Christians sometimes do, but intrinsic to the Christian faith, and particularly the Catholic faith, like education and aid to adoption and medical practice. That is, to put these in their historical context. They're nothing new, really, but they're part of what Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence called a long train of abuses and usurpations. Though, of course, he was talking about the King of England. In this case, these usurpations are on the part of local, state, and federal government in American history. Religious freedom has always been a work in progress in America, requiring, like the protection of all liberties, the constant vigilance of the citizenry. There just never was a golden era in the American past where religious liberty was not under some kind of threat from individuals. Think of the rioting of the early 1800s, from interest groups, from government, and sadly enough, of course, sometimes from Christians themselves. In the 1800s, many Americans sincerely believed that limiting the freedom of Catholics actually ensured religious and civil liberties. Contemporary secular ideologues believe something very similar, only they want to curtail all religious freedom in the name of a proliferating umbrella of individual and group rights. So that when progressives talk about freedom of worship rather than religious freedom, they're in fact being regressive. They're going back to the 1700s, which is quaintly reactionary of them, I think. They're the closest thing to an established church, if by church, in this case, if we take church to mean a body of thinking about the human person and the nature of society that is established in law and in court decisions and in culture, and against which dissenters face legal disabilities, or dissenters face public shaming, or demagogic attacks aimed to intimidate them into silent acquiescence or withdrawal from the public square. In that sense, we do have an established church. In our day, the secular humanist believes that the default position is his, not realizing that secular humanism, along with its militantly atheist offshoots, claims an orthodoxy all its own. It's not neutral. It's a substitute for religion. It's not the absence of a worldview. The militant variety wants to scrub the public square free of every vestige of religion, maybe not understanding the connection between religion and culture, or at least I think understanding it all too well. So that the established church the framers feared is here, only it's not a church. It is predicated, however, on the very liberal ideas they proposed as guardians of conscience and religious liberty. And so I always like to close talks with a few questions because nobody has all the answers, and certainly I don't. My 4-year-old thinks I do. And then when I don't, it's a major life trauma. But here's the questions that Christians in all countries should be free to ponder. I say in all countries because, we really have it easy in America when it comes to religious freedom. When I give this talk to international audiences where there's Africans and people from South America present, but particularly those in Africa, like they come to Grand Rapids to Acton University every summer, they're like, wow, this sounds easy. Somebody gave you a dirty look at work? Oh, you poor thing. because they kill people in my country and they put them in jail for good. But here's the question. What is religious freedom? Is it toleration? Is that what we mean? Is it a naked public square? Is it a crowded public square? You're tripping over things in the public square because every religion is represented with some symbol or another. Is it a free market for religion? Is it that kind of competition? And if it is a free market for religion, then where does that leave truth? So the big question for me is, how does freedom of religion relate to freedom of conscience and the freedom to be wrong, the freedom to err, in light of the fact that Christianity makes demands on the common good? And that Christians believe and want everyone to know the truth so that they can be free. Know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. But what if something like religious freedom is holding that back? So these are real questions, I think. And so I'll close with a couple of quotations, one from Edmund Burke and one from Orestes Brownson, one an Anglo-Irishman who was not Catholic, and one an American who was everything and then finally Catholic towards the end of his life, Brownson. Burke had said that people have the right to many things. Law and order, they have a right to justice, they have the right to the fruits of their labor and the ability to make their labors productive. But he said, quote, men have no right to what is not reasonable and to what is not to their benefit. Burke thought liberty had to be limited, to quote him again, in order to be possessed. That limits were a good thing. The American Catholic convert and philosopher Orestes Brownson was of a bit different mind. He formulated the American approach this way, that error has no rights, but the man who errs has equal rights with him who errs not. Should that be he who errs not? Is there an English teacher present? But I think that's close enough. So I'll leave you with that, thinking which of these great thinkers is right. And I was told you're happy to do Q&A, and I love to do question and answer. And so thank you very much. That's the end of the formal part. A good question. So in case you couldn't hear it, the question was, what kind of comparison do you see against the religious bigotry against the Quakers and Catholics and Islamophobia? There's some. It's a great question. It's one I've dealt with before, and I never quite know because I think there wasn't a large number of Quakers who actually were engaged in trying to undermine the government and kill people and that sort of thing, right? And it wasn't part of the Society of Friends to want to rule. In fact, the problem with the Quakers seemed to be that they didn't want to go to war against the Indians. It was Benjamin Franklin who told the Quakers, look, if you're going to be the leaders in government in Pennsylvania, you're either going to have to lead us in war to protect the frontier, keeping in mind who was where first. We're just giving you the story here. You're either going to have to give up your faith in some way, compromise it, like what Brownson called political atheists. I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I wouldn't do anything about it in the public sphere, that kind of thing. That's what you're going to have to do. And the Quakers said, okay, then I guess we're done with government. The Catholics sometimes, in English history at least, would do dumb things like try to blow up Parliament, which made it really easy to vilify them. And so what what's the comparison? I think the best comparison is this is where I get to quote Solzhenitsyn, I guess, from the Gulag Archipelago, where he writes that there's this line between good and evil, he says, and it runs across every human heart. So when you're talking about people, there are always going to be a mixed lot. And so the question about Catholicism in the 1800s was a lot like the question about Islam now. Is there something intrinsic to the faith that is anti-democratic or inherently coercive or violent? And one of the main historical differences between Christianity and Islam would be that Christianity was illegal for its first 300 years. And so we have this very long tradition of the church being separate from the state, and Augustine talking about the city of man and the city of God and what they both take care of. And that wasn't the case under Islam. So there's that lack of that tradition, in other words. Beyond that, I'm not qualified. It's so safe to I get to talk about George Washington most of the time, and James K. Polk and things like that. But never an expert on these things. When I was giving lectures on the Mexican War for a while, people would always ask me my opinion on the Iraq War. And I was like, I don't really know enough about it. Give me a couple hundred years. I'll get a little hindsight on me, So I would refer you, if you want to know a little bit about that history. I did the inaugural Authenticum lecture, a similar series to this in Grand Rapids, and that's on YouTube, and it was about the Battle of Lepanto, which was when the Pope and Austria gathered up their forces for a decisive defeat of the Ottoman Empire, bottling them up in the Mediterranean and ending their dream of European supremacy. And G.K. Chesterton wrote a great poem by the name, and at that same Authenticum lecture, another gentleman recited that poem. And it's worth watching. Even though they misspelled my name on YouTube, I'm trying to deal with ego during Lent, so it's okay. But that'd be a good place to go. And there are plenty of books to answer that. I think Bernard Lewis is a good historian of Islam. He's somebody to look into if you wanted to read on that topic. So it's a good question. And this is a question that's been grappled with. So when your religion makes demands on society and culture, to what degree can you try to cause those demands to be met? And so when the Catholics were first immigrating to the United States in the 1830s and 1840s from Germany and Ireland, it hadn't been too long before where it would have been illegal for them to vote or hold public office, for instance. For similar arguments. That is, Catholicism was held to be inimical to Republican government, so that a bad Catholic would be able to participate in democracy, but a good Catholic wouldn't be able to. I'm not sure that Thomas Jefferson did write those words, but I'm not sure he believed it entirely. If you know about Jefferson, so what Jefferson meant when he talks about all men being created equal and it being self-evident, this is the kind of thing that would only be self-evident to somebody who grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth, on a mountain in Virginia, and had the leisurely life to be well educated. Because if he was to look around, of course, he was surrounded by people who entirely lacked liberty. He believed that the Indians possessed a natural liberty and not to intermarry with Americans, but he thought his African American slaves had been so denuded by slavery that they would never be capable of liberty, so that they had been made congenitally inferior for liberty. In the case of Islam, it's back to that question of what kind of Islam are we talking about. I do think when I hear statistics that 10% of Muslims would approve of terrorism in certain cases, I think 10% is a pretty big number when you're talking about 1 billion people. But the person you ought to invite here to talk about this is Dr. Dennis Marshall, one of our theologians. He's an expert on this sort of thing. At Aquinas College. I would say I see kind of an affinity. I'm not in West Michigan, so it's safer to say this. There's a certain sense in which the overarching majesty of God argued by the Calvinists is derivative of Muslim thinking on the grandiosity of God as well. And so that even in the Reformation, we get kind of a revisitation of this non-Trinitarian God that's so powerful that, as I understand the hadiths that I've read and the bits of the Quran, that if God wills evil, it's okay. And so there's certainly deep problematic things with Islamic thinking about God, as I understand them. But again, I'm no expert on that. But I do know that at least among the founders, even Washington, though he would have used the word Muhammad and lumped them into the same category with using Christians in terms of religion begetting morality. What they were intent on was saying, if you're going to engage in self-government, you got to have virtuous people, and virtue comes from religion in some way. As Eisenhower later famously said, it doesn't really matter what it is, but it does matter, by the way. But so virtues are good habits and vices are bad habits. And if you can't govern yourself, you can't govern others. You can be a vice-ridden, corrupt population, and that's okay if you're ruled by a king with his boot on your neck and he makes you behave. But if you're actually in charge of the place, you might have to be capable of virtuous, independent decisions. Yes? Oh, I mean, persecution is all relative. So I talked about the Mormons and the people in that time period. Black slaves lacked. I mean, Catholics could vote, right? I mean, so Catholics could vote in the United States. So could the Mormons, except in Missouri, where the government issued the Mormon extermination order, which is just what it sounds like. There were several important moments, I guess. At least around the time of the Revolution and later, there were what was the family from Maryland? The Carroll family and Bishop England. There was this earlier generation who were Enlightenment thinkers and who seemed to be trustworthy with liberty. A lot of it's deeply rooted in ethnicity, the fear of the Catholics later. It's the Irish and the Germans and people coming from monarchical areas, not the homegrown Catholics. So that even some of the homegrown Catholics would look down their noses at the Irish and the German Catholics who would come from overseas. Eventually, it was going to be the Jesuit Father Murray, who was, I think, instrumental in influencing the Second Vatican Council in describing freedom of conscience and religious liberty in such a way that Protestants could find amenable. But even some Catholics, including myself sometimes, when I really think about Murray's writing, cannot. Because I do think in some ways it tends towards an indifference toward the truth. So I would say definitely John Courtney Murray played a big role. The Knights of Columbus, many of you will know, played the instrumental role in adding the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance during the 1950s. Although the Pledge of Allegiance had been written by a socialist back in the late 1800s, who was a strong nationalist after the Civil War and who wanted to, enforce the idea of the very centralized country. So that would be the best thing I could say. The other would be that unintentionally Catholics played a role in diminishing at least Christianity in the public schools, because after having been forced to say Protestant translations of the Lord's Prayer or to read from the King James Bible, it was Bishop John Hughes who played an instrumental role in establishing the Catholic educational system in the United States in the first place, saying that the local schools in New York City in that case were de facto Protestant schools, therefore they're not really public schools at all, so we need our own school system. And that was long before the bishops at Baltimore later demanded that every Catholic parish have a school. So that by the 1950s, some of the people pushing to get prayer out of public school were actually Catholics because of the sense that the schools were de facto Protestant. In other words, better just not to have it at all than to have your kids be Protestantized or evangelized in that way. So there's kind of an ugly complexity to the history, I guess. So I didn't mean to blame everything on the secularist ideologues. Oh, I see. Yeah, I think Burke is right, and I think Brownson is wrong. I mean, I think we make things illegal all the time, don't we? Obscenity laws, etc. And so it's a matter of argumentation, but in a democracy, what that means is this involves legislation, it involves court systems, it involves a number of other things. And one thing we know is that religious freedom in U.S. history led to a proliferation of Christianity in general. And the Europeans could never quite understand this because they came from confessional states where there were very strict laws about this kind of thing, and the churches were already empty by the late 1800s, and they're even emptier now. And then they would come to America and they say, why are so... Didn't make it, huh? Why are there so many Americans in church? They have religious freedom. You think they'd just be done with it and go have a good time or something. But religious freedom, interestingly enough, leads to, at least in the United States, has led to a massive growth of Catholicism and a widespread influence of American Catholics around the globe. I mean, in the church in Rome, I take students to Rome as part of our Rome semester program every year at Aquinas College. I could spend a lot of time there, but a week's better than nothing in Rome. And there's just the Americans are all over the place, and they're in the Vatican bureaucracy, and at least the local priests there, most of whom are from Africa, will tell you how much they love the Americans. But the people who are so jaded and coming from the European countries, they just don't have that experience. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and kind of argument. I think Catholics always have to argue for truth. But in our public square, where the secularists even consider the idea of God not even a possibility, where do you start that kind of dialogue? Jay Budziszewski, the natural law theorist at the University of Texas, talks about the fact that while we might all have some sense of the natural law deep down, the more junk put on top of you from the culture of death and everything else, it's kind of hard to find it. You know, at some point, how do you reach people is the question. That's always a question of evangelization. You know, you reach farmers by telling them parables about farming, and you reach fishermen by telling them parables about fishing. How do you reach people? And in our day, that's particularly difficult. If I can I throw out a C.S. Lewis quote, Father, before you question me? Yeah. Okay. So when we talk about America's post-Christian, it's a lot more challenging because one of the things the pagans had going for them is that they were really interested in truth and groping for truth. And C.S. Lewis describes this, you know, trying to evangelize in a post-Christian society as what did he say? He said the post-Christian man has about as much in common with the pagan as a divorcee has with a virgin. You know, it's difficult to go back. Yeah, I think religious liberty right now is under the greatest threat it has been since the time period that I study in the 1840s and 50s. I mean, I think it really is. I don't think it's an exaggeration in the United States because for the first time, I mean, I don't know what the new administration is going to be like, but at least the concerted effort from the U.S. government, but also state governments, to thwart religious liberty and pretty reasonable claims to religious liberty, like the Little Sisters of the Poor, for instance, are not wanting to fund abortifacients, that kind of thing. And this is pretty reasonable stuff. So Catholics in the name of religious liberty aren't arguing for public tax monies necessarily, though I think some do when they argue for vouchers for their schools. I don't think they know what they're getting into when they argue for that, but you know, some do. And with the right intent, right? Your goal is to educate children, not to be beholden to some kind of ideology that says public schools are best no matter what. So we've got to keep kids in them even when they're failing the kids. But if you're really worried about the kids, maybe you want them in a better school. So, I mean, there is a tension there. I don't make light of the tension. But I think you got to be ready for the public shaming and the legal action. No, I haven't. So I wouldn't know to recommend it. The 4 books I put on the back of your outline are all history books that deal with the information. I think Cardinal George's books, The Difference God Makes, and especially The Godly Humanism, because what the kind of book you want is the one that tells you what secularism really is so that you don't find yourself arguing against it on its field of battle, using its terms and its assumption. That's the kind of book you want. I think George's books do that. I think Anthony Eastland's writing style is not for everybody. It's not for a lot of people, but it's but if you can get through that style and you like it, you know, you like the sharp-elbowed wit. I think even his books about children and humanistic education are going to be very good. So you have to really know what I call it the field of battle in terms of the church militant is. You have to really know what the field of evangelization is to do it, and you have to see it as that. Not just destroying your opponent, but trying to save your opponent. And destroying your opponent is very different than saving your opponent or working to do that. I don't think, as far as I know, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think my Catholic faith is predicated on the long-term existence of any civilization or government. I think that's the great lesson of Augustine. So if not to put a note of despair at the end, I'd say that's a note of optimism. Civilizations come and go, right? But keep your eye on the everlasting and what the ultimate goal is. Sure, we want to re-Christianize the culture and save the culture and thereby save people, and you Christianize a culture by evangelizing people. But But in the end, every individual human soul makes a difference. So I think that when it comes to the kind of argumentation we're talking about, you just have to know who you're dealing with. You're never to engage in even a pleasant civil disagreement with a Bible-believing Baptist the way you will with a secular ideologue. Because you actually have a ton more in common with the Baptist than you do with the ideologue. Even if you and the ideologue are in the same political party and you and the Baptist are not. I think, anyway. And I have the microphone. So, okay, thank you very much.